Привет, друзья! G'day guys, welcome to another Soviet lens review. Today we're going to be taking a look at one of the most mass-produced Soviet telephotos that you probably haven't heard of. So let's get into it. Alrighty guys, so we are going to be taking a look today at the Jupiter-21M. It is an f4 200mm Soviet telephoto that has a pretty interesting history. And as you can tell from me holding it up here, it is a pretty chonky lens. But first up, where did the lens come from? Well, it started off its life in the 50s. It was designed by the Soviets at KMZ, of course, very famous Soviet optical plant at Krasnogorsk, and it was based off the Sonar optical scheme. That was, of course, penned by Carl Zeiss. Now, off the back of that scheme, the Soviets managed to put 4 lenses in 3 groups, and they achieved a 200mm focal length from that design. And this lens was manufactured right from 1957 with its earliest prototypes, and then maintained serial production right through into the 80s. In fact, you can tell from the first 2 digits of the serial number of my copy that mine was made in 1983. Now, this is the Jupiter-21M, and you can also tell that mine was actually made at the Vologda plant, VMZ, but it was also made at Krasnogorsk, KMZ, and that's important because the versions, the later versions in particular that were made at Krasnogorsk were called the Jupiter-21A, and they had that different shank, the different mount. This is, of course, M for M42. Now, the Jupiter-21A versions are apparently the ones that you want to get. They had a higher rated sharpness according to their official technical documentation, and even more light transmittance as well. And on top of that, they even had a shorter minimum focusing distance. So that was sort of a V2 of the Jupiter-21 if you look at it like that. But onto this lens itself. So this lens is one of the ones that was produced, as I said, at the Vologda plant. You can tell by the Vologda logo right there. Now, this is the Jupiter-21M, which of course comes in an M42 shank, and that's how I adapt it to my Nikon Z6 with the M42 to Nikon Z adapter. But talking about tech specs, let's get into the tech specs of this chunky telephoto. So to start off with, yes, it is heavy. It is made completely of metal and glass, as with just about all Soviet lenses, and it clocks in at about 1 kilo, a bit under, in fact, at around 980 grams. Now that makes it very kind of wieldy when it's on your camera, and you feel like you've got a pretty serious lens whenever you're using it. So I love that, that kind of weight that it's got to it. But not only does it have weight, it has a focus ring which turns 270 degrees, which makes it really nice to focus with when you have a copy that's properly oiled or properly lubricated. Unfortunately, mine, it just has a slight issue towards the end of the focus scale, which makes it not that pleasurable to focus with, unfortunately. But if you've got a good copy, one that's clean, it is very precise and very fun to use. Now, as well as that, this has a 56mm filter thread on the top of it. You're not going to be really using too many filters on the Jupiter-21M. I think, you know, if you want to try long exposure, or who knows, maybe a UV filter, that could help. But at the end of the day, yes, not many filters that are usable with this lens. It does have an inbuilt lens hood, as you can see here. And that lens hood even has its own, I believe it's 78mm filter within that, which is curious. But this lens has a minimum focusing distance, as I mentioned before, of 1.8 meters. So you really can't get too close, but for a 200mm telephoto lens, that is par for the course. And the aperture goes from f4 all the way down to f22 with nice clicky half stops in between each f-stop. Now, this lens does have a very impressive aperture as well. It's one of the best features of the Jupiter-21M. If I stop it down to around f11 here, you can actually see that it is a 8-bladed aperture. And that's going to mean that you really are going to get some very clean circular bokeh all throughout the aperture range of the Jupiter-21M. Now, that's what I like about the Jupiter-21. What about what I don't like about it? Let's talk about some photo characteristics. So, first off, you might have noticed that those aperture blades are actually not coated. They are just metal, and that creates some internal reflections. And I think that's one of the worst characteristics of the Jupiter-21M is its resistance to flare. It has none, effectively. So anytime you put any hard source of light anywhere in the frame, the Jupiter-21M just does not deal with it, as with many other Soviet lenses, but the Jupiter-21M particularly, it will just lose all contrast in the frame, and the image will become pretty much unusable. So definitely want to avoid that. Now, sharpness is something that you're going to be looking at when you're buying a 200mm lens, because of course you want a lens to be sharp, and you want a lens at that focal length to be sharp. Otherwise, maybe it's better just to use a shorter focal length lens and then punch in with a crop after the fact. And I'm here to say that the Jupiter-21M, it does have a pretty decent level of sharpness in the middle of the frame. When you stop it down, it's certainly a pretty uniform level of sharpness across the entire field of the frame. But this is not a Soviet lens that I would, rank in my top 10 sharpest Soviet lenses. It is not necessarily a pin sharp lens, at least the Jupiter-21M version, which I have. But the Jupiter-21A, which was made by KMZ, does reportedly have 50 lines per millimeter of resolving power, as opposed to the 40 lines per millimeter of the Jupiter-21M. So all that's to say is that if you're looking to get yourself a Jupiter-21M, you should really be trying to pick up the Jupiter-21A instead, because it is going to give you a sharper result. But sharpness is not the be-all, end-all, of course, and the Jupiter-21 does do very well in some other areas. I've already mentioned bokeh, but as well as that, chromatic aberration, it does well in as well. A common characteristic across lots of Soviet lenses, it really handles chromatic aberration well, both lateral and axial chromatic aberration. So purple fringing, you don't really see much of that with the Jupiter-21M, and chromatic aberration at the near and far edges of the field of focus, you don't really see much either. So you get some points in that regard. But why don't we take a look at some photos to dive deeper into what this lens can produce. Okay guys, here we are. I've just opened up Darktable, and I've got some photos from the Jupiter-21M here. First up, we've got this magpie. He's a local magpie near where I live. We call him Broken Beak because he does in fact have a broken beak. But what you can see in this photo is the Jupiter-21M's really nice bokeh. So both the foreground here and the background, you're going to see it's really, really nice. And that is because the Jupiter-21, it has the aperture of f4, which at the 200mm focal length, f4 is going to get you a lot of blur. It's going to get you, some really nice depth of field, and you can see that. Now, the magpie itself hasn't been sharpened at all, so it doesn't look super sharp. You could definitely touch that up a little bit in post. And also you see the sort of neutral colors of the Jupiter-21M coming through here as well. This would be very gradable. If you wanted to up the contrast a little bit, up the saturation a little bit, then immediately it's starting to look a lot more like a shot taken with a modern lens. Here we can see the longitudinal chromatic aberration of the Jupiter-21M. Now, of course, with longer focal lengths, that means that you're probably more likely to get longitudinal chromatic aberration, which is when the out of focus areas before and after the plane of focus start to kind of show a color tint. Now, you can see just a little bit of it here, particularly in this line of bokeh in the background here, just a little bit of a tint of green or yellow in that background. There is a slight tint of purple in this foreground out of focus area here, but overall it's very modest, and it's not too bad at all for a 200mm lens. I think this really shows that chromatic aberration is a strong point of the Jupiter-21M. Next up here, this is a great example to show the flatness of the field of sharpness that the Jupiter-21M produces. So you can see it's a relatively sharp image. This has not been sharpened at all in post, straight out of camera in JPEG. I mean, you're getting a lot of resolution here on this sign. I mean, you could crop in this file. Let's go all the way into 100%. And you see there's a lot of contrast, there's a lot of sharpness there in the center of the frame. And if we scroll all the way to the edges, it's getting slightly worse, but not too bad at all. Okay, next image here. This is an example of what happens whenever you have a light source in the shot. Whenever you're taking a shot with the Jupiter-21M, it just really goes to crap. I don't even know what this was, whether this was the sun or just some bright light reflecting off the street, but as you can see, all of this contrast in the center of the image has just vanished, and that is why backlight, not a friend of the Jupiter-21M. And here again, this is just another example of what you can get with the 21M, with the Jupiter. And if we zoom in here, you do see a touch of purple fringing around these very high contrast areas on the climber's rope and even the rope here. But it's really not too much. Again, this is zoomed into 100%. And you can just barely see it. No corrections applied, of course. So really, when it comes to chromatic aberration, just about all of it that comes from the Jupiter-21M is correctable. And finally, I just wanted to show this image because I love the bokeh here. The bokeh is the strongest point of the Jupiter-21M. The bokeh it produces is just magical. A little bit of cat's eyeing up in the corners there, but it just feels so nice to, get this subject completely isolated from the background, and that's what you can do with a 200mm f4 lens. And it's not busy, even though this was a very challenging background with leaves that were reflecting the sunlight and little bits of the sky popping through. You're not distracted by it. It really does just fade away and puts the entire focus on this central subject. Okay guys, now onto sharpness. I've taken a few test photos with the Jupiter-21M and I've just put them into an algorithm that is similar to a modern camera's focus peaking algorithm to get a sharpness value out of these photos. And what we can see here is that at f5.6, you're actually going to get the sharpest result out of the Jupiter-21M. Now, a lot of that is due to the effects of diffraction, and particularly because it is a longer focal length lens, that diffraction really starts to creep in a lot earlier than some other lenses. So basically, you never want to be stopping the Jupiter-21M down below f11. So guys, that is it, the Jupiter-21M. It is a really fun lens just to have on the end of your camera, take out for a little bit of street photography, bird photography, wildlife photography, whatever you want. It's just a fun lens to have, and it's one of those telephotos that you just really feel like a pro. Just by holding it and having it on your camera. People will look at it and think, oh wow, that dude's got some 200mm f2.8 professional lens on it, whereas in fact you do not. You have a very cheap, very cost-effective, $100 US, if that, Jupiter-21 lens on the end of your camera. So definitely worth it if you're in the market for a 200mm lens, but remember, pick up the A version and make sure that you get the best Jupiter-21 that you can. For now though guys, that's been it for today. Thank you very much for watching. Let me know, do you have a Jupiter-21M? Do you have any older telephotos that you like using? Let me know in the comments down below. But until the next time, I'll see you then.